Hello, everyone. Greetings to all you David Foster Wallace devotees out there, you super intelligent and marvellously empathetic creatures. And hello to the rest of you as well. I hope this evening's discussion helps you to join us soon, because this self-righteousness is very comfortable. Welcome to this Wheeler Centre event presented in partnership with the Melbourne International Film Festival. My name is Sam Cooney. I'm the host, if you haven't figured that out. I work as the publisher at The Lifted Brow. I'm also a writer and a university teacher, and I'm an unabashed David Foster Wallace fan. Here with me on stage are three intellectual colossuses, ones who do not require bandanas to contain their mighty brains. Let me introduce them one by one. And as I do introduce them all, I just wanted them to answer two quick things: whether they're David Foster Wallace fans or not, and whether they could just tell us on the internationally recognised footnote rating scale how many footnotes out of 10 footnotes they give the Foster Wallace film. So on my left immediately here is Steph Harmon. She's the founding and managing editor of Junkie, a politics, pop culture and comment site which publishes work from some of the best young journalists and writers around Australia. She was also editor of The Brag in Sydney, founding editor of Throw Shapes, and appears occasionally on ABC Radio, FBI Radio and The Project. Steph?
Yes. Fan.
Are you a fan?
I am a fan of David Foster Wallace. I would say not a fanatic. I own all of his books. I have read most of them. I have dabbled in all of them.
Okay.
I give the film maybe like seven and a half
footnotes. 7 overly long
10.
footnotes out of 10 overly long footnotes. Good.
Mm-hmm.
Melinda. So, Melinda here next to Steph. She scored her own dream job, TV critic, in 2006, after 20 years writing everything from local news to celebrity profiles and hundreds of books, film, food and bar reviews. These days she contributes as a critic and columnist to most Fairfax newspapers, to Radio 3AW and 2UE. She lives in Melbourne, and her first novel is titled Cat Jumps the Shark. Melinda.
Yes.
You a fan?
Huge fan.
Okay, huge fan. And how many footnotes out of 10 footnotes?
6.5 footnotes from me.
Okay. And David Scott. Ronnie Scott here is the author of Salad Days from Penguin, and he's founding editor of The Lifted Brow, where he published work by David Foster Wallace. He is a writer for The Saturday Paper, The Australian, The Monthly, The Believer, ABC Radio National, and many, many other places. Ronnie, fan?
Yes, I'm a fan. I don't think that there... Is there anyone in this room who is not a fan?
Don't put your hands up.
Yeah. No, a massive fan. And I think I give the film 1 3-page long footnote and then 10 maybe kind of tiny little footnotes quibbling with that one long footnote.
So is that 11 footnotes out of 10, or is that 10.11 footnotes out of 11?
I think it's one footnote.
I think you just turned it up to 11.
Yeah, right. That sounds good.
One footnote, does that mean you hated it?
No, I liked it with many, many kind of little David Foster Wallace-like qualifications.
Okay, got it.
Tonight we will be talking about Foster Wallace and the film, alternating between the two. What I did want to first ask, and we can even just start with Steph on my left, just to quickly talk about who Foster Wallace is to you, maybe professionally, but also personally, or whatever really comes to mind.
I discovered Foster Wallace probably pretty late in the game. I studied at the University in Sydney. I'm from Sydney. I majored in English and did a course on modern and postmodern American fiction. And I started bringing all these books to work that were like, the Roths and the Franzens, this whole group of writers that I was completely completely wrapped up in these worlds. And then from there, actually discovered Dave Eggers before I discovered Foster Wallace. And someone I worked with said, if you like that, you need to go back to, what he's channeling a little bit, and gave me Infinite Jest as a present, which is a mean present, as anyone would know. And that book just completely took up, I think, 2 or 3 months of my life. And from there, I discovered his essays and his journalism, and then I think his short stories were probably the last that I touched on.
Yep, cool. And just quickly staying on you for a second, in your role as Junkie editor, how have you seen perhaps...
Thank you
for
that.
I just realised that was way inappropriate. How have you seen perhaps, if any, David Foster Wallace's influence on writing, or perhaps even wider culture and internet culture?
Yeah, I think, obviously David Foster Wallace started writing before the voice of the internet was developed in any kind of real way, but when you look back at his work now, Infinite Jest is a great example. It's so internet-y. You can't read it linearly. There's nothing linear about it. The internet can make up for that now with, hyperlinks, and, you can read some of his essays now, I think. The host, you can read it online, and the footnotes are actually part of the text, so that makes it much more pleasurable. But
that's not the point, is it?
That's not the point, exactly. I think, so he pre-captured the voice of the internet in a really big way. The flip side of that, as the editor of online writing, I've noticed a lot of young writers still emulate him or attempt to emulate him in ways that can be extremely overbearing and often not successful. Which I think it's something really great to strive for. He's a fantastic writer, and if that's who your inspiration is as a writer, I can't fault you, he's great. But I have noticed a lot of writing trying to take bits and pieces of him and just not being as good.
Mm-hmm. And Melinda, Foster Wallace, who is he to you professionally, personally, whatever, between?
He was a big influence on me. I read Infinite Jest not long after it came out.
And was that the same as Steph the first time you'd read him?
Yeah, that's right. So I think I read Peter Craven's review, which was kind of foaming, and I thought I've got to have a look for myself in the same way that Lipsky does in the film. Mm-hmm. And it was just at a point in my writing career where I was just starting to get a bit of momentum. And years before, a mentor had said to me, you need to find your own voice. And I didn't really understand what that meant. And then I read Infinite Jest and I thought, that's what it means. Mm-hmm. That really direct, intimate conversation. And that sort of became my mission from then on, was to write not like David Foster Wallace, but to write like me, rather than be a writer.
Right. And you're a TV critic.
I am.
What do you think David Foster Wallace would have made of television today? That's a big one.
I've been thinking long and hard about this because he was that great advocate for making the hard things fun, and he wanted books to do that. He wanted avant-garde writers to also make an effort to engage the reader rather than making the reader do all the work. I don't see that a lot in books, but I see that a lot in television, where there are shows that are really accessible, really sort of friendly, but are also, have as many layers as you want to examine. And of course, TV is such a wonderful writer's medium as well. What he'd make of it, what he'd make of binge viewing, exactly. I think he might be concerned.
I think so too, perhaps.
Yeah.
And Ronnie, who was David Foster Wallace to you?
Kind of a little bit like Melinda, where I read David Foster Wallace, not when Infinite Jest came out, but when I was kind of 17, 18, 19, sort of the right age to get completely blown away by it, and to never have read anything like it. But unlike you, where you took it as an opportunity to find your own voice, I took it as an opportunity to find David Foster Wallace's voice, and sort of was one of those terrible, really young writers of the type who pitched to you,
Not
Steph.
terrible. I feel like I've painted them unfairly.
Right, okay.
Some of them are great.
Well, I was quite terrible. But and then sort of very, very slowly figured out how not to write like a very bad imitator of David Foster Wallace. But yeah, he really kind of changed the way that I thought about the world and about books and about writing and the way that writing could be structured. And I think that he has this really sort of seductive style. And there's a reason that he sort of permeated the way that people write, not just on the internet, but the way that they write fiction as well. But yeah, he kind of means a lot to me. And I started with Infinite Jest, just like you guys did. Right. And then moved to the essays and short stories.
Right, which I think nowadays it's much the other way, right? Most people come across his non-fiction, and whenever I recommend him, I always say, try these few essays and then read Infinite Jest. Like you have to read Infinite Jest, but perhaps giving someone that book is not, that it puts a big burden on them, perhaps. Just staying with you, Ronnie, do you want to perhaps just quickly tell us the story, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but from my understanding, you, as in your role as editor of Lifted Brow, published the last original piece of fiction by David Foster Wallace.
Yeah, I don't know if it was the last original piece of fiction. It could have been, but I think that there were some other excerpts of The Pale King that came out kind of elsewhere and before the book came out. Right. But what happened was when he killed himself, I was very upset about it, as lots of people were, and I wrote a letter to Bonnie Nadell, his agent in the US, just explaining what the Lifted Brow was. It's an independent literary magazine based in Melbourne, and which Sam now edits. And kind of just explaining how much he'd meant to me. It was sort of a really long, heartfelt letter, basically asking for a piece of fiction. And she was crazily kind. Did not need to dig anything up, but did dig something up. And at the time, I think, we paid $200 for it, which was way beyond our resources. We'd never paid that much for anything before.
It was twice we'd ever paid anybody else.
Yeah. And I years later, it occurs to me how gracious they were by kind of letting us do this and accepting that. It is crazy. It's really crazy.
The reason why I called it original is I was under the impression, and again, we should talk more about the brow sometimes, but that they sent you an excerpt from The Pale King, which was obviously the posthumously published novel, which the excerpt never ended up running. That particular excerpt never ran in the novel. Is that correct?
No, it is in the novel.
Oh, it is in the novel.
Yep.
So I've been telling the story for many years wrongly.
That's okay.
I'll make that down.
No, tell people that we have an original David Foster Wallace story that isn't nowhere else.
My version's so much better. Cool. That's great to know. Let's have a drink sometime. Now, just more broadly, before we start talking about the film, what do you think, for better or worse? And I'll just throw it out to you guys, whoever wants to jump in first. David Foster Wallace, what do you think his legacy is? We talked, specifically more, but is his legacy a good one, and is it all-ranging, is it wide-ranging, or is it something that maybe, is it very much in the writing and publishing world, and that people outside of it aren't really being influenced by him at all? Or do you think that it's that his tentacles, for want of a better word, are everywhere in perhaps culture, but even outside of culture?
Who first? You go.
Okay, I'll have a crack at it. I think that he has a huge and enormous impact on a lot of young writers. I think you're right when you say I think a lot of people encounter Infinite Jest and are blown away from it when they read it at a young age. I don't know that he changed the face of fiction. I do think that he's certainly changed the way a lot of people read, and has changed the way a lot of people have ambitions about their own writing. A lot of the stuff that kind of gets pinned as something that he has changed and left an impact on, as with anything, when you say one person changed it, you can look at various examples 100 years in the past where people were doing a similar thing. But I think as a modern writer, and as someone who is so aware of himself, and then aware of being aware of himself, and then was still able to take this overarching wide-angle view at entire worlds that he constructed, I can't think of another writer who's able to do that and affect me as much.
Mm-hmm. Have you guys have anything to add?
I think that this is a really good question to ask in 100 years' time, and unfortunately, it's tough to answer now. I think that you can see sort of David Foster Wallace influence writing, both stylistically and in terms of the type of content that it addresses, kind of everywhere. But how much of that is purely David Foster Wallace, and how much of that is kind of this sort of general movement of kind of writers who were sort of around in the 1990s, who were still alive today, and he was sort of one specific facet of that, and certainly kind of the most ambitious and most well-regarded of those writers as well, and that was the case before he killed himself too. But I think that it's more interesting to look at him as his own thing, with his own concerns and his own things that he may well have been writing about today had he not died.
Yeah. Yes, I think because he was a unique talent and just had that super brain, you don't really see anybody else doing that. It's an absolute one-off. But I think in that melding of high art and pop culture, I think, as you say, it was kind of in the zeitgeist anyway, but I think that's really sort of blossomed, and that's an ongoing legacy.
Yeah, and I think just going back to that point as well, when I was talking about the internet voice of the internet, that's something that is so through his writing is, he will say something extremely intelligent and smart and academic, and then temper it with that kind of folksy, I'm just your friend here, we all talk in a kind of same casual way, which makes it really a lot less frightening to read a sentence like that when it's dappled with colloquialisms. And if you think about blogs, that was similar when blogs started and people didn't know what they were. Are they letters to our friends? Are they diary entries? Are they meant to be articles? I think that he did leave a legacy in that way of just merging these different worlds of writing, maybe.
Yeah, and definitely I was the same as Ronnie, someone who copied him for a long amount of time very badly, and then stopped trying but moved through that. I think it's important. That's creative writing 101 is to imitate first and then try and break away. There's plenty of conspiracy theories out on the internet about this, but one of my favourite is how much Foster Wallace perhaps affected other big mainstay writers, insofar as he grew up, Jonathan Franzen obviously was a very good friend of his, but some others who saw themselves as maybe the next big voice. And then David Foster Wallace came along and they all went, shit, here's somebody who's doing what I want to do, except he's 50 times better than me. And one of my favourite, because a couple of Franzen's early novels were quite experimental and quite interesting structurally, and now he writes, these great big American novels, for want of a better term. And one of my favourite conspiracy theories, and there's a fantastic essay that's far too long and far too involved about this, but about how Franzen made a deliberate choice, said, I'm never going to be this, so I'm going to do the opposite and to write the others. And that, I think, he is one example, but I think many people have sort of said, well, that kind of territory is now off limits because I'm either going to be seen as an imitator or I'm going to just be ignored because it's like, well, I read this person when you can read the better version. So.
Or just never get published.
Right.
I think, Foster Wallace said himself that he was lucky that Little Brown took Infinite Jest on. I think he was, because it's a fairly frightening prospect. The idea of editing that book just sort of makes your eyeballs bleed. But I think even if you were trying, even if you're doing a half-decent job, I think you'd really struggle to make it into print.
That's interesting. I do want to talk about the film,
Yes.
I do want us to talk about the film some more at least once. Just to throw it open, but instead of asking you generally what whether you liked or disliked the film, let's hone in perhaps on Jason Segel and his portrayal. I don't know about you guys, but I got home on Saturday night desperately needing to watch clips of Foster Wallace so I could separate their two faces out again and get rid of Segel's bumblingness out of what my memory of Foster Wallace was. But I also then found myself watching clips of Segel talk about his portrayal, and he's a very honest, guy, and he talked about how he didn't want to do an impression. He didn't want people to look up at the screen and say, oh, look at Jason Segel acting, how good is he, good on him for trying. And so they decided not to do an impression, because Foster Wallace had a mannerism, he had a cadence, he was a nervous person, his eyes darted a lot, and there isn't that. Do you think the decision not to do maybe a more deliberate impression was the right one, or do you think it would have been better to really go for it and try and really evoke the Foster Wallace that perhaps we know, through acting?
I think it's always better not to do an impression if you're in any kind of biopic. You have to take a couple of things that make you identifiably that person, and then just be the actor rather than the mimic.
Yep.
And I think he did that reasonably well.
Yep.
Yeah.
With what qualifications? What do you mean reasonably well?
Well, it's funny for me because I had never seen David Foster Wallace until I rushed home from the movie and Googled clips of him. I only knew him through his writing, and I had this quite vivid picture of what he was like. I'd seen pictures of him, and then I'd just been talking to him, he'd been talking to me. So that edginess, that reserve, that wasn't the David Foster Wallace I knew, and yet when I looked at the clips of him, that was actually kind of what he was like. But when I was just reading him, he was so open and so engaged and so not nervous. So that they were my reservations, that watching Jason Segel or Segal, he was so fidgety and uptight, and I thought that's not the Foster Wallace I know.
Steph?
I think he did do an impression a little bit. I don't think that he really. I think he did a fantastic job. I thought he was incredible in the film. I thought I couldn't take my eyes off him, which is remarkable because I think that he was also he removed himself quite a bit. Like, he wasn't the focus of the film. I don't even know if it was a film about David Foster Wallace so much as it was a film about David Lipsky. But I think Jason Segel did a fantastic job of there were parts of his performance that I think were lifted directly from videos you can see of David Foster Wallace, like even just down to the way his mouth moves when he talks and it goes off to one side and it can almost look like he's about to break into a laugh or a sneer, and I thought that came through really clearly. Perhaps the way that he speaks was a bit different, but he was still very measured and still took 3 or 4 more seconds than you'd expect to answer a question. Yep. So I thought he did a really, really good job that verged a little bit more on impression that it sounds like he intended.
I think whatever he did, we'd probably be bagging him out. That's the problem. Like, it was a hard role to take because, and I think he knew that. One of the best, I read a lot of things after the film, but one of the best descriptions was, or not descriptions, but kind of the comparisons was to the Bob Dylan biopic with the many, many actors playing many facets. And, that resonated with me because they were talking about how the Jason Segel was one Foster Wallace and we didn't get the other, however many there are. And that was perhaps, unless you were going to create something as experimental as the I'm Not There film, that you perhaps couldn't convey all those different versions unless you were David Foster Wallace.
Especially because I think the film is told through David Lipsky's memory of David Foster Wallace 10 years after they hung out, or more even. Yep. So it is just one version spoken through someone's memory as he listens to tapes and reconstructs based on the fact that he now knows that this guy has just committed suicide.
Yep. Yeah, I wonder... Well, number one, I think that it's incredibly brave of Jason Segel, or whatever we want to call him, to have decided to do this role. I'm sure very lucrative as well, and that's fine. Because of course, everyone's going to take issue with it. I took issue with it. Friends of David Foster Wallace's when alive took issue with it and wrote really kind of searing essays about it, about how this is not David Foster Wallace. Of course, it's not David Foster Wallace.
What did you take issue with?
What did I take issue with?
What are your footnotes?
Well, okay. First of all, I was completely hoodwinked by this movie. I loved it, and for about 24 hours after the film, I just was so happy to walk around with this impression of David Foster Wallace as I think I described it as like a big, emotionally needy, shaggy teddy bear.
Yeah, right.
This sort of tender, vulnerable person who you could see kind of grappling with genius and depression and his attempts to be human and all that stuff. And then slowly my feelings, if not totally soured, then at least thickened a little bit after a little bit of time had passed. Because it's a very affectionate portrait of David Foster Wallace, if not reverent. And it does kind of play into this myth of him as this person who was at base like a very good guy, trying to be sort of a normal guy, trying to grapple with how to be this person who's written this incredible book. And it seems a little bit cartoonish the way that it put that stuff together. And of course, no one is really like that, I guess.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I definitely got a feeling, a little bit of myth-making there, the sort of the tortured artist, kind of coming into cliche territory with that portrayal, and especially with a guy like that who was so complex, it seemed it just felt a little bit thin. Yeah. But
then it's such a trap. Like how do we portray him unless we cast 10 actors?
Exactly. Yeah. The David Foster Wallace estate expressly, distanced themselves from this film and wished it wasn't made, and there's plenty to be read about that. But Melinda, you touched on before about how you knew him through his writing and had never seen clips, and how much his writing, the voice was much more confident. Do you, even though it wasn't probably wasn't possible because of the estate distancing themselves from the film, do you wish that, like I did wish that the couple of times when they cut the scene before he starts reading in the bookshop, and I wanted to hear his words verbatim, kind of even read out, and I missed that complexity. Do you wish? This was my huge problem with the film, and why it only got 6.5 footnotes, is because I bought that book as soon as it came out, because it was about David Foster Wallace, and I remember my initial feeling of disgust when I realised it was a transcript. I thought, that's not a book, it's a transcript. And then I started reading it, and I completely fell in love with it because it was David Foster Wallace talking. And the film just wasn't, and it could never be unless you made some
then that would just be stupid.
Yeah,
if you know what I mean?
Gimmicks or something.
That's right. So you're always just going to be picking out, cherry picking quotable quotes, which is a completely different experience from the way that incredible breadth and depth of expansiveness of his mind that comes through in his writing, I think is just impossible to depict on film. So it's not, I think, a fault of this particular film. Mm-hmm. I think it's a fault of trying to make a film of it at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the central themes of the film is how impossible it is to truly know anybody.
Yes.
And I think that, with the book that it's based on, David Lipsky made obviously a very concerted effort not to inject himself. He tried to make it as objective a representation of the conversations as they had it happened, right down to when the tapes were changed and all of those details. And it's, I think that the film for that reason is a lot more like the obituary David Lipsky wrote than it is like that book.
And I also agree with you that, of course, in the book it was all Foster Wallace, and the film it's very much that two-hander. So it's at least as much about Lipsky, which is fine.
Yeah.
But,
and fascinating. Like, he's an interesting guy as well.
He is an interesting guy, yeah.
Yeah, I think as a depiction of David Foster Wallace, it's problematic, of course. But as a biopic, I thought it was kind of successful and certainly interesting. Like, I loved the fact that it was based on just four very specific, very particular days in this person's life, and the fact that it focused on David Lipsky more than it focused on David Foster Wallace, certainly, because we've all seen those biopics of artists, and everyone's kind of familiar with the tropes and the things, the kind of notes that they have to hit, where, okay, this is the moment where you meet the person who changes your life. This is the moment where you just offhandedly articulate your whole artistic philosophy, all of that stuff.
This is the childhood moment that shapes you.
Yeah. Let's reveal the relationship with the parents and things like that. And I loved that it kind of got around that. Yeah. I think that that's much more honest. And so maybe that's why I was happy-ish, mostly happy to see one particular version of David Foster Wallace, one particular snapshot, which surely wasn't accurate, but which I thought was like a pretty good experience.
Mm-hmm. This might be a more general question about these kinds of films, but do you think this film should not have been made if the estate did not approve? Or do you think that someone has a right to tell this story or tell their own, the filmmaker, the director has the right to tell Lipsky's story, which is also then becomes his story? Or do you think that the estate should be able to have some kind of veto on this kind of thing? It's a big question, but maybe then just talk about this particular film instead of in general. Do you wish that this film wasn't made, or that the estate that had one out?
I enjoyed this film so much that I would not be comfortable saying I wish it wasn't made. Mm-hmm. But I do think, it's like obviously problematic. I think that with people that are figures like David Foster Wallace is a figure who, whether it's right or wrong, is often credited with like being a complete pioneer in fiction, and there's never going to be a film made out of Infinite Jest, I hope. So this is kind of the closest way.
People have tried, like art grad school students have tried and stuff. But
God, that would be awful. But I feel like if you're going to make a film that involves him, this is a reasonable way to do it. I think when it comes down to the family and loved ones of someone who's passed away, if it ever happened to me, I would really hope I got the last say. So it's a difficult question to answer. Yeah,
and maybe it's an irony that I'm not sure if the film fully recognises or not, but many parts in the film there's dialogue of Foster Wallace's character saying, I don't want to be famous, I don't want to be idolised, this is my struggle, and here is a film that's doing that. And so and I'm not sure, maybe they knew this and then did it anyway, being like, we can't do it any other way, but that's interesting to me, and like that must have been a hard decision to be like, we are literally have the tapes in him saying, this is what I don't want, but let's do it anyway.
Especially in like all of his writing, and even in those interviews, it feels like he so wants to have the last word, even if he's having the last word against himself in the footnotes and the endnotes. So it seems kind of mean to just be like, and now here's a whole thing about you that he can't respond to.
That you can't control.
I mean, so I think one of the things in favour of this film is that we will get worse. Like, we will get a bad adaptation of Infinite Jest, a really bad one, I'm sure. And we will get the schmaltzy kind of, birth to death biopic. And we will get the film about David Foster Wallace's relationship with tennis, which is like Oscar bait and has a terrible, quavery voice Midwestern narrator and is meant to be heartwarming. And
or the true story of his drug addiction.
Yes, we'll get all of that. And so I think that in context, this just isn't that bad. And I mean, maybe thing to do is to appreciate the film with, again, kind of with reservations and with qualifications, and to do it understanding that the estate, and the estate is just his wife,
his wife and his editor.
His wife, his editor, his agent, his family. It's not some huge David Foster Wallace corporation, like that they don't like it and think about why they don't like it.
Mm. Yeah, I think I wouldn't say a blanket. All films should be made regardless, but I think this one, yeah, absolutely. You understand why the estate would not want it, because David Foster Wallace would have hated everything about it. But as you say, it was respectful, bordering on adulterous. And yeah, I think if you were going to do it, this is a pretty nice way to do it. And I think you've got to be very careful about saying this shouldn't be made. You know, I think most of the time you should be able to have a crack.
Yep, cool. Just a quick straw poll. How many people here have seen the film? Hands up. Oh, not as many of you as I thought. We're going to talk about something that could be considered a spoiler, but of course it's not really, because it's not a plot-based film. But there is a final scene in this film which people have written about, and it jarred with me both. It got me emotionally, and I saw some non-dry faces in the audience on Saturday night, and ran into a couple of people who said that they teared up at the end, as well as a couple of times throughout. But that final scene has been striking chords, for better or worse, with people. Without maybe, I don't know if we want to talk about what it is, but it ends on a warm note, a hopeful note, we'll say. Do you agree that was the right note to end on, or do you feel like that is totally painting the wrong picture of what happens after this film in true chronology? Can
we say what the scene?
Sure, go for it. Yeah.
It's not a massive spoiler.
No,
he's
not.
He's dancing in a church. But
he's dancing in a church. It's like loose camera work, soft lighting. It looks very happy, and he's found this is his center and stuff like that, right?
He's dancing to Brian Eno.
Yeah, he is. He's dancing to Brian at the Big Ship, which was one of his favourite songs, right? So, but do you think that was the wrong call, perhaps, for the film?
Yeah, it was really. Well, no, okay, this is the thing that curdled me about the film, because it hit me right in the guts, like it did with you. It was really kind of beautiful and upsetting, and I think that that for that to be the last image of the film, it completely makes sense. It makes sense for movie making. A film needs to hit kind of certain emotional beats. It needs to leave you feeling a certain way at various points, especially afterwards, or you're going to walk away feeling like you've just watched two people talk at each other for 2 hours, right? So I think that it was a good final image, and it seems, and then a day later I realized it's completely dishonest for various reasons. One of which is that he wasn't a happy person, right? He wasn't a person who abandoned himself freely by dancing. It's a weird note to end on.
You guys were talking before about the facts behind that, though.
Well, yeah, again, just in the copious reading after the film that I did on Saturday night and Sunday, that Foster Wallace used the cover of a Baptist church that he would say he was going dancing, when what he was really doing was going into the program, into sessions of the Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, and he would say, to avoid having to tell people or to have to have that conversation every time, he would say, I'm just going down the road to the church to dance. He did also visit churches, and he did visit different churches. He was non-denominational and just liked to be in those places, not maybe in a religious way, but in a place that he was just interested in them. But the dancing was a cover for his much darker,
So
core.
did the film just get that wrong?
I don't know. This is what we can ask the director. We invited him in tonight, but but I don't know. But this is the thing we have to kind of wonder, don't we?
Mm.
Yeah, I hated it, and I'm afraid I don't know if I'm.
Did it get you at the time?
No, I don't think it just must be really mean and cynical or something.
You're distanced.
I was. I think that's one of the reasons why I came out of the cinema with such a kind of sour feeling. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was just stupid, and as you say, dishonest.
Oh, that song is so hard.
No. The beautiful end for me would have been when they're out of the car. Lipsky gives Foster Wallace his book. Foster Wallace, as you say, is sort of holding it, juggling it, this tiny little book with these enormous hands, and he says to him so kindly, I'll read it, I'll send you a note. That would have been beautiful.
Well, I wish it ended, in that scene where he gets the shoe in the box, and he's tearing through the newspaper to find the extra notes in there, and there's nothing there, and it's just the shoe. That would have been a great note for me.
That would have been a great note for me as well. So either of those.
Maybe we should write in and see if we can get a new cut.
I think we should.
We can just don't watch the last 30 seconds of the film.
Go now.
I think that a part of the fun of maybe that scene and, throughout the film, Jason Segel's physicality is so incredible, especially when he's sitting just in, a lot of the scenes are just him in the car, David Foster Wallace in the car with David Lipsky, and Jesse Eisenberg's David Lipsky is so small in comparison to this massive man, and at the end when he hands him his book, the book just looks tiny in Jason Segel's hands, and he's like holding it, and David Lipsky's looking up at him, and Jason Segel's like, yeah, I'll read it, but his book just looks suddenly matchbox size in this big hands, and that to me, that would have been a great ending, because it's such a, obviously it's a bit on the nose as a metaphor, but it's still nice.
But it also, it's because, yes, I mean, it's about their relationship. It's about their, as you say, it sort of works as a metaphor.
But it was fun watching Jason Segel dancing in a church. So
no, I found it a little bit embarrassing.
I'd like to see Jason Segel dancing. I just don't want him to do it as Foster Wallace. That'd be. I've got one more question, guys, before I'm going to throw it to you. So please get them ready. That was just a good little segue into the book handing over thing. People have called this film, and you mentioned it before, that it's not a film about Foster Wallace as much as it could be called a film about Lipsky. Some people have called it a love story between two people. One of the best descriptions I read was that it's a story of a man's ability to actually speak to and hang out with his younger self and give advice and maybe try and do something good for this person's life, knowing what he has ahead of him, knowing that he wants these things, and when he gets these things, if he ever gets them, they're not going to be as good as he thinks they are. Do you agree with that, perhaps, that description?
I think that's a really nice reading of it. I didn't come away with that myself.
It's not my reading.
No, it's not your original idea.
It was definitely someone else's, but
But yeah, I think that's a lovely way to read the film, yeah.
Do you agree? You made a bit of a face then. Do you agree with that?
No, that was just a face. I completely, I do agree. I think it was a really good film about a relationship between two people, like whatever its relationship to reality was. I think that that it was really kind of moving, the way that it was about someone who was a less talented writer, not just a sort of a younger writer at an earlier stage of the career, but one who was not this juggernaut, who was never himself going to be profiled in Rolling Stone, sort of sparring with both his own ego and David Foster Wallace, and also his need to kind of create this wonderful article about him as well, because he was, I think, still on probation at Rolling Stone while he was writing it. So he sort of had something to prove to his editor and needed to kind of wrangle this person into a form that could help his own career. And I thought that all that stuff was really well done and really well put across. I think that it would be so deceptive to say this was a film about that relationship. I think it was a film about David Foster Wallace. But I think that stuff was really tense and really memorable.
Steph, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that if it was about David Foster Wallace's relationship with his younger self, then he would have a pretty nasty opinion of his younger self. David Lipsky doesn't come across as the nicest guy. I mean, I think it's automatically going to be a troubled relationship when one person has a dictaphone and the final say and the other person doesn't. But I think there's too many different power imbalances for me to be comfortable with that, because the power shifts so often through the film. Physically, it's there. There's like a big moment of tension between the two of them, and Foster Wallace is like standing over David Lipsky, but then he's constantly saying when he's being interviewed things like, well, what would you do? What would your answer to this question be? And he keeps trying to flip it back on Lipsky, and he's so worried about how Lipsky perceives him. I think that the power is too complicated for it to just be younger self.
Yeah, I did enjoy, one of the aspects I really did enjoy was that whole sort of seduction and betrayal of the, being the journalist.
And for me, that was unexpected, I think. I was thinking it was going to be more Foster Wallace and Lipsky just being more of a foil. I didn't think they would put Lipsky's true character through, and David Foster Wallace's vulnerability to and awareness of who was being written about, and that this person had, if the article ever got published, which it never ended up getting published, but that he held a real power, even though he was smaller and younger and less talented. He held a real power.
All the stuff about sort of going through the bathroom cabinet and that sort of thing, and sneaky note taking.
Okay, before we need to go throw out to some questions. So, like I said, there's a couple of roving mics around. Feel free to direct your questions to all of us, to one person in particular. Wait until the mic gets to you. That'd be great. So, just throw your hands up whenever you have a question. Hi, Josh.
Hi, Ronnie. Thanks, everyone. That was very interesting. Thanks, guys. I have a question, I guess, for you guys as 4 readers of Wallace, long-term readers of Wallace, and perhaps more than any other sort of writer in contemporary history, or contemporary fiction, sorry, he exerted a lot of control over his readers. Like if you look at the scholarship, for example, on Wallace, people draw a lot from his own criticism, not just of himself, but of his own work. I mean, he wrote a great deal of critical pieces on contemporary fiction, contemporary literature. He was a very astute critic, sort of a sociologist in a lot of ways. I guess my question is, what do you think the relationship is between Wallace and his reader? Like, who is the ideal reader of Wallace? What's your experience in that respect?
One of you, go for it.
I think that does he say this in the movie or does he say it somewhere else? That he wanted to write in a way that was complex but not difficult, and a way that reminded the reader not of how smart David Foster Wallace was, but of how smart the reader was. And I think that that's not an answer to the question, but I think that he did want to be a successful kind of, probably he would have, maybe this is a wild supposition, but maybe he would have liked to have been the kind of writer that Franzen was, and been on Oprah, and maybe not been on Oprah, but kind of reached more people than he did. Like maybe part of him would have really liked the reputation that Infinite Jest had as being difficult and postmodern, because otherwise he wouldn't have written it. But also probably he would have liked the idea of being someone who would reach many, many people. Do you think he wanted to be a generalist writer?
I think that tension was part of what defines him later on in his career. And with the letters, there's a lot of letters between him and Franzen, which you can read bits and pieces of, where he says, when he was writing The Pale King, he got so stymied in that process because, on the one hand, I think he says something along the lines of he enjoyed the trickery and he enjoyed all of the mazes that he made the reader go through, and he does think that there is a part of fiction that should be a challenge for readers. But by the same token, I think he felt like he couldn't do that again, and also didn't want to, and wanted to write something that was more broadly applicable, but also that came to a solution instead of just presenting a series of problems. I think that was a big conflict with him, I would say, as someone who has never met him.
I think the question of who is the ideal reader is one I'm still puzzling over a little bit. I wish I hadn't brought it up because I've got no idea. Look, he certainly, he talked a lot about worrying that people were raving about Infinite Jest without having read it. He certainly wanted to communicate. He talked a lot about, it was the challenge of the next generation of writers to create an intimate relationship with their readers.
The myth, at least while he was alive, and sort of excerpts of The Pale King were being published in various places, and the book looked like it was going to be something that was not that metafictional, not that kind of postmodern, and in fact, very much sort of a traditional realist novel from a lot of the excerpts. It looked like he was taking so long to write it because he was struggling against whatever, his kind of go-to style was, and was trying to do something new with that. And then, of course, after he died, it's suddenly looked like, whether this is true or not, it was taking so long because he was wildly depressed. And also, the version of The Pale King that was published is kind of half this sort of like kind of return to realism, or sort of new realism for him, and half very much like Infinite Jest and like his short stories, and kind of metafictional. And so who knows? I don't know, but it looked like he was trying to write something that was beyond his own style.
Yeah. All right, another question out there? Yep, thanks.
Thank you all. You talked a bit about the literary legacy, the place in culture before and after his death. Could you talk a bit about, for want of better words, the moral project, the legacy of that, or the influence of that, and just related to the film, is there any sense in which the film might have been motivated, making of the film was motivated by an attempt to continue on that project? One of you mentioned the desire to touch or connect with many people.
Ronnie, you mentioned something interesting about, I think you were talking about his morals in the email thread that we started before this, or not morals, but like his kind of drive, you know, that earnestness stuff. So maybe you can take this on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well,
flinging it over.
I don't know about the film as a means of continuing what he was trying to do, but I think thinking about his... So, okay, I personally feel like his legacy could go either way, and actually maybe these things are sort of bound up together, right? But one of them is this tortured artist who, you know, all of those things that we associate with being a tortured artist, which is, you know, struggle and suicide and being a difficult person. And the other one is this completely kind of schmaltzy, inspirational speaker type David Foster Wallace, which we see in that quite wonderful Kenyan commencement address.
One speech that's now like, taken on so much more meaning.
Which is it's a great speech, and it was a commencement address, which is why it's kind of schmaltzy. But with his moral project, he was a very moral writer in lots of ways. And so when he was writing Infinite Jest, and using this kind of postmodern metafictional style, it was this very deliberate attempt to reappropriate that from writers who had used metafictional techniques in the 80s to kind of dismantle realism and to show the artifice of effects of realism and kind of revel in that. And so he was using this stuff, turning it against itself, and attempting to show varieties of kind of feeling and morality and sort of the human heart that had been thought inaccessible through this kind of technique, right? And so his moral, when you say his moral project, I don't know if you mean specific things that he wrote about in his essays, or if he was just a moral writer, like one who attempted to not just kind of be tricksy, but to reveal feeling and meaning. In which case, I think that this film does further that project because it is the schmaltzier side of David Foster Wallace, and so it's maybe a simplified version of him as a moral character. Like, which I don't mind at all. I don't mind the schmaltzy Wallace. I'm happy for everyone to remember him that way. I think that's great.
I feel like a lot of his projects was he wanted to convey the message of that schmaltzy address, but knowing that if you just told people that down the line, it was very easy to bat it away, and it was a superficial thing. Whereas if you came at people through many writings, non-fiction, very complicated fiction, that it might maybe through osmosis and slowly that might come through a bit more. Again, this is posthumously, you know, rearranging and assuming that someone like that had, or anybody has, kind of designs on their own path and what they're going to do for the culture and for people. But he did often talk about that fiction was a place to bring people together, or writing was a place to bring people together. Very much fiction was a place where, you know, you can communicate with at least the author, but also these characters, and he was very interested in people, I think, recognising, again, with TV and more people spending more and more time alone, that the importance of connecting in real ways deeper was important, and perhaps that was, but again, I'm just postulating widely here, but perhaps that, you know, the two of them aren't mutually exclusive, like you were just saying, Ronnie. Melinda, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't have a great deal to add. I just think, yes, he certainly was a very moral person. I think the kind of things he was saying explicitly in This Is Water, where I think really there in a lot of his non-fiction works, if you think about, even Consider the Lobster. Yep. You know, I love the backstory on that, where it was supposed to be... But
even the premise of that, just let's consider the lobster.
Yeah,
like, you know, which
that's right. Or the McCain, you know, Up Simba. So much of his work was about how to live well. Is there a legacy from that? Are there other writers doing that? I don't know.
That's a good question.
It's a good question.
Probably don't have time for that.
No one springs to mind.
I think it's the answer. I wish I'd asked that earlier. Thanks, Melinda. Another question out there? Just over here.
Yeah, g'day. I didn't like the movie hardly at all. But you know, you were talking about the inevitability of other movies being made about David Foster Wallace or from his material. And the movie did get me thinking about what could possibly be filmed, what would interest me in seeing. The only thing I could really come up with would be like Paul Thomas Anderson doing The Pale King or something like that. Was there anything is there any part, you know, from the Foster Wallace canon that you think could be filmed? Or should they just leave it all alone?
I don't know. The tennis games, the Eschaton tennis games. When I lived in Berlin in 2011, and there was because it's Berlin, of course, a group of people did a walking, like a 12-hour walking tour, which was supposed to be a representation of Foster Wallace, and I only chimed in for about 4 hours before I had to leave. But they did reenact the game, which was very complicated. Had a rule system, but it made no sense even when you read it closely. And people played it, and it was quite interesting to see.
The Decemberists.
Oh, they did. They yeah. Sorry.
Interview with Hideous Men was made.
Yeah, and that was made with what's the other big bumbling American actor from The Office?
He's not big and bumbling.
Yeah.
Sorry, but is it John Krasinski?
Krasinski. He's big and bumbling. He's not as wide, but he's bumbling.
Yeah.
He made brief interviews with Hideous Men.
But was that released?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can see it. I don't know how well it was released, but you can watch it. Yeah.
I think it would be tough to do many of his. I haven't seen that brief interviews, but I think if you think of some of his journalism is delightful to read. Regardless of how much of it is embellished or factual, which is a whole other debate. But I love the cruise ship one. A lot of people love the cruise ship one. That almost could be a fantastic thing in and of itself, but so much of it relies on his internalizations that I just can't. I can't work out. I can't work out how it would work.
And I was thinking when I was, being cross about this film, which I also really didn't like very much, but I was thinking, in fairness, I rarely like a film that's been made from a book. I would struggle to think, the odd short story maybe, but mostly they don't. It's always unsatisfying, books made into film, and I think you could times that by 100.
Especially
if you're talking about
if ones have internal monologues.
Yeah, that's right.
I think as a book, this one works probably the best.
Yes.
And also having James Ponsoldt direct it makes so much sense because, I don't know if anyone's seen his past 2 films, which I've watched. They're all about long conversations basically between people and relationships between difficult people and some people who are bad for themselves and other people, and you're sympathising with them, and they're just talking at each other. So it really made a lot of sense for me that they chose that book and that director. I don't know. Do you have any that you'd like to see?
The Eschaton again film.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I think the non-fiction would be really excellent. I'd love to. Again, but you could do it in a very surreal, hyper-coloured, technicolor way. I think as well it would work. Hunter S. Thompson-style films. Where they go over the top because the character of Foster Wallace, and without wanting to get into that whole terrain of how much he bent the truth, he went to a lobster festival, and where you or I might have a lobster and see someone throw up, he managed to see 27 amazing things, and same thing on the cruise ship. He managed to have experiences that perhaps one person on one cruise wouldn't have, but it was serving a greater truth, arguably. But that giant eyeball floating around, which he sort of had, which was one of his favourite metaphors, kind of thing. But I don't know either about sort of filming particular scenes or anything. That horrible short story where the baby catches on fire? No, not that one. We'll have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Yep, at the back there.
Thanks very much, guys. You guys touched on something that has been like the biggest dissuasion for me. I haven't seen the film yet, and I don't think I want to, which is that in the Lipsky book, Foster Wallace talks so much about how disinterested he is in fame and how much it interrupts his creative process and actually drives him towards depression. And also the fact that he's really troubled by the amount of attention he's getting from people that he presumes have not had time to read his book, given how soon after its release the tour is actually happening. Given how much time he devotes to that in the Lipsky book, what do you think the ambition of the film is in terms of his legacy?
We touched on that a bit. I don't know. I think there was probably some deliberate ignoring of that fact by the filmmaker because he loved it or something, or maybe feeling like so much time's passed. David would have loved it now. He would have changed his mind. But which is maybe again deliberate story. Tell yourself to make something you really love. I think the film was made with full, honest, authentic intentions to do something good in the world. Yeah. But whether that is the case or not. And
I think some people who are famous don't like fame, and that's a reality. And I think it's okay to make a film about that. And I think especially in the literary world, it's a bizarre thing because writing is such a personal pursuit. I think that definitely it comes across in the film. I haven't read the full book, so you're probably right. There's probably much more where he's saying he's not comfortable with it. But I think it seems to be understood as a transaction. He needs to do a book tour, he needs to do this stuff. And then David Lipsky in the film comes to represent, as the Rolling Stone, that's a pop cultural institution. He's basically the star maker. as that particular journalist from that particular publication, it's a really good representation of what happens when a writer becomes famous and becomes like a rock star. And I think that whether or not that impacts on his legacy, I'm not sure, but I think it's an important story. Again, that doesn't mean that I'm completely comfortable with it.
I also think that really, apart from those few people who are very close to David Foster Wallace, no one's hurt by this. You know, it's not doing any damage. Maybe his family and a couple of friends think, wish it hadn't been made. But as we've said, it's a very affectionate film. It's wanting to preserve something that the filmmakers love about him, and it's doing no harm. So to that extent, I think, that conversation you're talking about, David Foster Wallace would have hated this. It's kind of irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
I think if it ended on a sadder note rather than the happy note it ends on, perhaps they could have got the point across a bit more strongly that this wasn't something he wanted. But ending it on a happy note kind of lets Rolling Stone and the filmmakers get away with it as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I just think that it's so unlikely that this film will be the last word on David Foster Wallace. Not just in terms of kind of future films and future biographies, but as if people won't be more likely to read some of his work in 50 years' time than they are to see this movie. And so which is maybe why I'm less bothered by it than maybe I should be, because his family is really bothered by it, right? Like really, really bothered by it. They hate it. And I think it's very hard to know exactly what the intentions and also the kind of the limits of the filmmakers were. I think I read somewhere online that the film was underway by the time they heard that the estate didn't like it. But who knows?
The first time they heard about it was when it was announced for release, and they were like, "Oh, cool! Would have been good to know." Yeah. But they didn't even go to them, which is interesting. They didn't even go and ask for permission.
And you'd think that if they felt that the estate would not have a problem with it, then perhaps they would have asked, or perhaps would have involved people.
Right. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. So before we wrap up, I do just want to thank the Wheeler Centre. I do want to thank Melbourne International Film Festival for having us, not only to the film, but also allowing this and being partnered up in this kind of event. I think it's fantastic. And then apart from that, I just want to say thanks for being such a great audience, and can you put your hands together for these guys, please?